Mike's live? We good? Will? Am I live? All right, let's go ahead and get started. It just gives me incredible pleasure to introduce Professor Nick Robinson today. Professor Robinson has been around FES. He's been a visiting professor here for many years, teaching international environmental law and comparative environmental law. He helped us establish our joint law and environment degree program with what is now the Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University, and he's been a really important resource for students over the years. While he's been around our campus for many years, I don't think that many of us know the incredible asset he has been in terms of international environmental law over the past half century, is what my notes say, Nick. Nick was named to the Legal Advisory Committee to the Council on Environmental Quality in 1969, which was the year the council was established. He practiced environmental law at the municipal level as general counsel of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He drafted New York's wetlands and wild bird laws, and he was the first chairman of both the Freshwater Appeals Council and the Greenway Heritage Conservancy for the Hudson River Valley. After tackling those state and local problems, he moved to the international level, and he became legal advisor and chairman of the Commission on Environmental Law of the IUCN. His collaboration with the Haub family 20 years ago resulted in the creation of the International Academy of Environmental Law, taking it from an idea they shared to a self-sustaining collaboration among 200 schools on every continent, educating future leaders globally. I should say, I want to recognize that we have with us a representative, the third generation of environmental leaders in the Haub family. Liliane Haub is here. Wave your hand there. Nick also edited the proceedings of the 1992 UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and he was a founding faculty member of Pace Law School, where he was responsible for launching their environmental program, which is now among the top 3 programs in the nation and is essentially the birthplace of both local and international environmental law. Nick collaborated with colleagues nationally to create the field of environmental law now taught in all major law schools. He's created an amazing legacy that has influenced the work of many of our own students here in FES. Nick is now the University Professor of the Environment at Pace University and the Gilbert and Sarah Kurland Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law Emeritus at the Elizabeth House School of Law at Pace University. So let's welcome Nick, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today. In a very short period of time, I'll walk you through 8 centuries. And I've really had to suppress myself, and I probably will err on the side of saying more than I should. I have to turn on this little machine. So thank you very much for that kind invitation. I'm going to talk today really about what's between 2 bookends. The first bookend is from 1217, when the barons and actually others, church leaders and even freemen, commoners, extracted from the King of England the first statute, the first charter that establishes environmental rights, the Forest Charter of 1217. Its anniversary was yesterday. You are here with this lecture commemorating the Forest Charter, as are people in London from Epping Forest, one of the first royal forests that is still preserved as a forest, saved by the people of the City of London, the Corporation of London, at the end of the 1800s. And they're having great celebrations. There were celebrations in the Forest of Dean that I'll be talking about. And we don't remember the Forest Charter here very much because it never existed as such in America. It was an English statute. But the other great bookend is just happening. In September, President Emmanuel Macron presented to the General Assembly of the United Nations the proposed Global Pact for the Environment. And this school has a relationship to that pact. And it will be the first statement, a global statement of the right to the environment. Now, obviously, one bookend didn't cause the other to happen, but my argument is that they both reflect a shared human instinct that we have in us to look for rights, rights that can legitimize our interests at a very fundamental level. You're familiar, of course, with human rights that do this for our individual fundamental rights. Well, the right to the environment that is emerging is a separate field beyond human rights, a field that begins to look at environmental rights, relationships between humans and nature, and the other relationships in an ecosystem. Does that sound fanciful, far-fetched? Is that something which is beyond what we can properly think about? Well, if I take you back to walk you through the Forest Charter, maybe I can persuade you it's not fanciful. And that's my mission today. 2013, I went in and qualified for a reader's card in the British Library and went to the rare books and manuscripts room, and I checked out this manuscript. I was armed with my little Latin dictionary in my 6 years of studying Latin that I never thought I'd use very much. And I proceeded to spend several hours poring over this tiny parchment. It's only about this big, and of course its paper did not exist yet. It was written on parchment skin. The ink was made from a tree, a little black ink. It was written with a quill pen, a tiny little pen, because there was not much parchment, and if you were a clerk, you had to write in really small Latin in order to fit everything onto the page. This is the Forest Charter from 1225, after it had been fought about for a number of years and finally consolidated in one text with King Henry III's seal attached. When it was first issued in 1217, Henry was only 9 years old. He didn't have a seal yet. And so his regent, the first Earl of Pembroke, William Marshall, proceeded to affix his seal to it, along with the papal legate, a man named Gallo. And they issued this extraordinary document. Well, we're going to talk about rights. Where do rights come from? The rights that we have are inherited. You didn't ask where you got certain of your rights. They sort of came with the territory when you were born. But there are at least 5 lines of inquiry about where rights come from. Positivists would say might makes right. And as King John granted the first Magna Carta, the first Charter of Liberties, so he could annul it. And that's, of course, what he tried to do. Natural law theorists would contend that rights are part of the moral firmament, and in the Enlightenment this was very popular. Religions believe that rights come from a divine creation or from sacred texts and religious orders. Social contract theorists see rights as agreed among humans and their institutions as an exchange of mutual respect or mutual compact of interests. But there's a fifth theory, which when I present it to lawyers, I get a very raised eyebrow, but when I should present it to biologists, I don't. And the fifth theory is not much discussed outside of biology, and it's the underlying theme of my discussion, and that actually of Elinor Ostrom. It is that humans fashion rights and laws as a consequence of Darwinian evolution. Darwin's evolution has to be factored into what is law, and we need to begin to think about that. So the proposition that law recognizes rights in shared resources, common resources, is a well-established one. We have legal concepts like usufruct, a civil law concept of a temporary use of somebody else's territory or resource, or easements, where you have the right to cross over somebody else's property for some function. But the more fundamental question of human rights is this proclivity for cooperation, which Elinor Ostrom identified in governing the commons. So let's explore a little bit the process here. I began looking at this and published what I didn't expect to be the first history of the Forest Charter in Dan McGraw's edited book, Magna Carta and the Rule of Law. This was going to be a great celebration of the 800th anniversary of the great Charter of Liberties, Magna Carta, from which the English derived their own Bill of Rights and from which we derived our Bill of Rights in this country. So it's the font of the concept of the rule of law and the concept of rights. It gave birth to the Forest Charter. On the 6th of November in 1217, King Henry III proclaimed the Carta de Foresta for the first time. Just because you proclaim it doesn't mean it will last. It had to be reissued 32 times by him and his successor, and then again all the way through the Tudor period with Henry and Queen Elizabeth, Henry VIII, because the kings would try to nibble away at what they had conceded and claw back rights that they wanted over the natural resources of England. The Forest Charter dealt with something called the royal forests. Runnymede is where the American Bar Association has this great monument to the Magna Carta, and in fact, Parliament and the Crown ceded that little area you're looking at to the United States. So it's American soil in England, celebrating our shared dependence on the Magna Carta. And this little area is right next to Windsor Castle, because when John was fighting with the barons, that was his territory, but it had a royal forest around it. It had a royal forest around it because the king needed resources. You couldn't just go out and have everything. You had to order trees and wood and grain and meat, all to be provided for your court. And in the 13th century, there was no marketplace to provide that sort of thing. There were some small little villages, but everyone had to be pretty self-sufficient, and manors provided the local resource for that. And so out of the 12th century royal forests, William the Conqueror and then his successors could set up a series of places around England where they could go and collect what they needed. They'd only stay there a month or two because otherwise they'd exhaust all the rabbits in the rabbit warren and the local supply of venison and so on. So they'd have to move someplace else, sort of a movable feast. But in the meantime, in the same places, we had the commoners. And the commoners had their rights also because, as I'll describe, commoners' rights were recognized by the crown. The crown had, of course, and so did the manors, the nobles and aristocrats' own territories. They had to rely on the farmers, rely on those who did the work in order to supply themselves. And so it was a mutually beneficial relationship. So, you know, if we look at questions that you can think about for 800 years, you know, can we think in terms of 800 years? It's a very long period of time to think something is happening. Are the conditions I'm describing so different that they're irrelevant to us today? I think not. These royal forests, as I said, were technically reserved for the king for what was called venison. Venison was not just deer, it was wild boar and other creatures, and timber, but mostly money. The king wanted these forests in order to get revenue for his own military and other activities. But to do that, he had to allow the commoners to go in for pasturage, to put their horses and cattle into the forest, to collect plants, vert. Vert was a generic name for lots of different plants, and pannage, to run pigs this time of year in the fall to eat the acorns, but also to mine. All of the royal forests, or many of them, had tin mines and iron mines, and there was an entire system of making charcoal out of the wood in the forests. So they were not bucolic parklands. They were industrial facilities of the 13th century. And they were adjudicated, the issues in the forests and the rights of the crown versus others were adjudicated by a series of courts and special officers called verderers. And the verderers still exist. Parliament has recreated them in the New Forest and in Epping Forest, but the ones in the Forest of Dean have been sitting since the 13th century and continue to be the original verderers. These forests, as you can see, were all over England. They didn't extend into Scotland and Wales. The English were fighting battles. They were not part of Great Britain. They were a foreign territory. But you can see how they spread around the kingdom strategically. The king liked to stay in the south, and there are a lot more of them there. The weather's better. He could perhaps harvest more, have more hunting. But if you take a look at the Forestry Commission's map adjacent, you can see the green areas roughly coincide with a lot of the areas of the forest of these royal forests. This is New Forest today. There are over 7,000 ponies running wild, so to speak, that is feral, but rounded up once a year in something called a drive. They're actually owned by commoners in the New Forest, but they have the run of the forest, as do cattle, as do the pigs that you see there, as do the deer. New Forest has extraordinary stands of timber. It's no longer harvested as much as it once was. You know New Forest, whether you think about it or not. You've all grown up with Robin Hood in our legends and the merry adventures of Robin Hood in various literary works, including Howard Pyle's. The Hounds of the Baskervilles features Dartmoor Forest, which has not very much trees in it at all. They were all iron and tin mines and forges. You have seen or grew up with Winnie the Pooh and the landscapes in that book, but now if you go to the local theaters, you can see Goodbye, Christopher Robin, and see Ashdown Forest because the film was done in Ashdown Forest. And Ashdown Forest is a former royal forest. Dartmoor Forest was famous even when John Jay, as our diplomat, left the United States to negotiate the peace treaty with Great Britain. He wanted to visit the Roman tin mines that were there. King John, in addition to having to grant the Forest Charter, or rather the Magna Carta originally, granted the miners in Dartmoor a stannary charter, which gave them self-governance to decide who could mine, where they could mine, how they should deal with disputes about the mining, and so on. A whole system of self-stewardship of shared natural resources was set up. And borders were set up in all of these forests. Something called perambulations were regularly held, in which the Crown would authorize knights, 12 knights usually, selected locally to be honest people, but also who could remember the past. Things weren't written down then. And so it was an oral customary tradition. And in these perambulations, officials from the Crown would come and meet with the knights, and they would literally walk the boundaries that people remembered of the forest and agree to them in an elaborate process. And every time the king wanted to aggrandize his power, he would reach into the forest and take a little of extend the boundaries and announce to the individuals in the forest that you are now in royal forest. I didn't give you permission to be there. You owe me a penalty for being in the royal forest. You owe me, if you want to stay, rent for your farm or your monastery or whatever part of the prior owner's land happened to be there. And on top of that, I'm going to extract from you 1/15 of all your produce and other things as a tax. Now, if you had been peacefully operating as either a baron with your manor or a freeman or even the monasteries and nunneries, and suddenly you had those extractions taken from you, would you think that's just? Well, of course it wasn't just. It was grossly unjust, and that caused these big fights. And every time the king wanted more money, he did that. To selective forests and selective places, and then there would be a pushback, and then there would be a new perambulation. The Forest of Dean, you know from Deathly Howls, where the great saga of J.K. Rowling's novel features Coppet Hill, where in Deathly Hallows Part 1, Hermione tells Harry that the snowy fields they're walking across are in the Forest of Dean. She grew up as a child in the Forest of Dean, and the forest informs a lot of the imagery that you find in her works. But to go back to a scholarly context, not that these are not, literature is a great form of scholarship. Elinor Ostrom's Governing the Commons brings us into thinking about, are these royal forests actually pooled resources, common pooled resources? She posits in her work that humans have, out of their controversies over shared resources, the capacity to develop cooperation, and that cooperation ultimately settles into perhaps a tense relationship, but one in which mutual cooperation exists to sustain the resources of the forest. She developed 8 design principles, and I'll walk you through those briefly. But basically, if you apply the 8 design principles to the common pool resources of royal forests, they match up rather nicely with the little history I've told you. And then if you take a look at what comes out of that cooperation, you find what is called in the Forest Charter the liberties of the forest. The first rights of the forest emerge. I'll walk you through how that applies in just one forest, the Forest of Dean. I can't go through 145 forests today. But having just come back from spending 4 days with the verderers in the Forest of Dean and wandering about, I can assure you, you should all go to the Forest of Dean and enjoy it. What are Ostrom's 8 principles? Well, and how do they apply to the forests? The principles that she has match up nicely with the story I've told you. First, boundaries. She says if you have clear areas that are demarked, you can have a context in which cooperation takes place, and the perambulations establish that for the royal forests. Secondly, the balance of benefits and costs. The customary rules about who could go into the forest and use what part of it when compensated with each other. The pannage, the going in and running your pigs to eat the acorns, was only done in the fall, and it was important to do it in the fall because if the cows that were running wild in the forest, or at least loose in the forest, free-range cows, If they ate the pig corns, they'd get sick. So it was really important to take your cows back out of the forest in the fall and let the pigs come in and clean up the supply chain for the cows. And the horses could be running there. And of course, all of these animals were very good at maintaining the vert so that the wild ferns and so on, some of them as big as you and me, would somehow be managed and the open space could continue. The third element, the collective choice arrangements, it's very clear in these forests that a process between the Crown and the commoners existed, and institutions grew up to mediate between their competing interests, including the verderers' courts. The verderers also provided monitoring and oversight. There was something called regards, and regards, the French Norman word, you would literally go out and inspect and regard the forest, look at the forest and see who was abusing their rights. So there was an oversight. Fifth, in the systems of formal and informal sanctions, there were lots of those and constantly being fought about. Where the king did not allow public participation, if you will, in deciding these issues and just use might, the people use might too. And there's an entire history of revolution against the crown for the abuses in the forest when the king would not live up to the promises of the forest charter. People took their liberties quite seriously. You then have the question of the various recognition of rights, the rights to organize and so on. Today, the commoners all form associations, NGOs, if you will, to defend their rights. And they still have rights in most of the royal forests to go in and exercise the traditional, ancestral, customary uses of natural resources. But in the old days, they would literally show up in the verderers' court and make their demands. In the Forest of Dean, as you'll see, they actually created an entire courtroom and a house in the very middle of the forest called Speech House, in which the free miners and the those using their common rights could appear and demand their own form of justice. Now, these 8 principles then apply, but I take them one step further in my discussion, and that is because the Elinor Ostrom's principles talk about rules. She has a lot about rules, but rules are not sufficient. Rules can be repealed, changed, revoked, and manipulated. And so she went into an area to look, why did rules come about? Why did cooperation come about? I take that premise, which I'll describe briefly, and then link that up to fundamental rights, whether they're human rights or what we'll discuss, the right to the environment. First off, my work shares a bond with Ostrom's, which is a common bond, and it deals with the fact that we were both taking into account what cognitive sciences were telling us about how humans behave. We humans are part of biological evolution. So it's incumbent upon us, if we're going to be serious and self-reflective, to figure out how do our creations in art or law or language, we're the only species that has such elaborate languages. We make wonderful forms of art. We can produce halls like Croon Hall. How does this all happen? Well, if we take a look at Robert Axelrod's study, The Evolution of Cooperation, he makes a very strong case, both empirically and theoretically, that we are hardwired as a species to cooperate. We grew up that way over many generations, indeed many millennia. And so these evolved norms are part of what it means to have human instincts, part of what it means to be people. Steven Pinker at Harvard, this wonderful book, The Blank Slate, he's written several others on evolution and human instinct, argues that, we don't want to think that way. We just shut that out. It's not part of what we need to talk about to carry on our daily lives, and so we don't reflect on how our instincts motivate us to do things. Ed Wilson, in his early book, Sociobiology, posited that humans have these instincts, that they are a result of evolution, and that we must begin to understand and cultivate these instincts. The great instinct of biophilia, the affection or love or respect for nature that causes us to have an affinity with the nature in which we grew up, is his logic. And of course, that is also the logic that the late Steve Kellert, who taught here for many years, invoked in the design of this hall, Croon Hall. This is a biophilic hall, and confirms, if you will, the logic of Wilson and Kellert, that biophilia is a human instinct that we can learn to use, that we can learn to cultivate. So by learning to cultivate our instincts, we can do something to advance the good side of those instincts. And that, of course, is very much what Ostrom was trying to say in her last works and in her address to the Nobel Committee when she received the Nobel Prize in Economics for her logic. Now, there was a Yale professor of law, Keller, who in 1918 began to walk down this same path, but it was a step too far for people to absorb at that time. And in the aftermath of the First World War and then the Second World War, it got laid aside by the legal community. But if we take a look at those who have dealt with cognitive sciences, we have to go back and find whether cooperation and other instincts are in us so that we can learn to cultivate them. Ostrom asked, how can we learn to cultivate cooperation? Because if we learn to advance cooperation, we'll somehow be better for it. And my inquiry really has been to ask, well, how can we cooperate better over the shared commons of this planet? And in particular, the debates going on right now in Bonn, Germany, on climate change. How can we cooperate better to be good stewards of the planet? And I argue that if you have a rights-based approach, as we saw in the 13th century, you will learn to do that a little more. So the biophilia in this hall, or principles like resilience, which I've been arguing is another instinct, that we can't not be resilient unless there's some grave problem with it, health-wise or otherwise. We bounce back as a species, and nature bounces back. Ecosystems can be resilient. And so all of these instincts are found in the Global Pact for the Environment that France has put forward to the United Nations now, including resilience, and including and especially premised on the establishment of the right to the environment. Now, these rights came out of Article or Chapter 48 of Magna Carta, the 1215 Charter. And in Chapter 48, the barons forced King John to agree that all evil customs relating to forests were to be immediately investigated by 12 sworn knights who were to go out and collect an inventory of everything that he'd done wrong and come back and fix them. Well, 2 months after he granted Magna Carta, he said he annulled it. He went to the Pope and said, I want you to excommunicate everyone who supported this, and it's all over. That was in August. He had agreed to it in June. By October, he was dead. He ate some bad food. His taster was not alert. A civil war was still going on. And the result of all of that meant that the 12 knights continued during the Civil War to collect their information. When the king died, Henry III was only 9 years old, and William Marshall, the first Earl of Pembroke, was a very extraordinary man, was made regent for the king. And he knew he had to rally the Civil War interests behind the crown again, and so he first agreed to reissue Magna Carta that John had annulled in 1216, and then in 1217 he proceeded to convene in October of that year a royal council, the Curia Regis, and they debated apparently, we don't have a written record, but they debated these reports of the 12 knights from those counties that came back. And they agreed on an entirely new charter. Only one of the chapters is the same. So the Forest Charter was a new set of rights that everyone agreed had to be proclaimed. And they grew out of Magna Carta. And in 1217, again, as I've said, the charter was issued. So what do these rights have? Well, the great penultimate, or the final clause in the Carta de Foresta on forest liberties says, it's an open-ended sort of grant of rights, whatever they were, ancestral rights that you can claim to the forest. These liberties of the forests and free customs traditionally had, both within and without the royal forest, are granted to everyone in the realm, in short, to everyone. Everyone is also obliged to observe the liberties and customs granted in the Forest Charter. And these barons were quite astute. Guess what the first right in 1217 was? The right of the people to go into the forest and collect berries, collect their vert, the things that an average person needs in order to get on with their life. Your rights to do that, and everyone's rights to do that in the forest, are proclaimed. Ancient borders were to be restored, perambulations ordered. One of the things the king did when he didn't like dogs chasing his deer, his forest officers would go in and literally cut off the paws of the dogs so they couldn't run after the deer. This was called lawing, not a very nice practice. And of course it upset everyone, so it was banned. It was much curbed. The freemen who had to run their pigs and cows and horses into the forest were entitled again to do so without forest officers trying to extract money from them. And freemen and others had their rights to hunt with hawks and keep birds and so on. William the Marshal, we don't have a picture of him, but he's buried in Temple Church in London. And he really saved the Plantagenet dynasty, which went on for 250 years. So he had a major impact. But in our part of the world, William Blackstone had a greater impact. He wrote commentaries that every lawyer and judge and public policy person, if you will, at the time of our colonial and revolutionary period knew. And he had gone in 1759 and went to every church and every place where a copy of Magna Carta existed and a copy of the Forest Charter existed, and he published for the first time a consolidated set of all of the authentic texts so people would know what they were. He resurrected, if you will, the Forest Charter in England. It was still well known, but he made it known internationally. Now, we had lots of forests in the United States, and we didn't have the same kind of competition until more recently with the Sagebrush Rebellion and other things. So the Forest Charter was ignored pretty much on our side of the Atlantic, but not in England. Every time, as I said, the forest rights were of the commoners were impinged upon, there would be pushback. And gradually people began to cite both the Forest Charter and Magna Carta for other causes in the name of justice. So the suffragette movement in England basically said, Magna Carta guarantees us the right to vote, and those of you who deny our right to vote have no standing. Of course, it took them a while to get that through, but they won. A similar thing is beginning to happen with the question of environmental rights. I'll briefly run through in a short time, 2 or 3 minutes, what you see here. This is King John hunting deer. Because in the manuscripts of that era, people would write about the king and the king's activities, no one followed what was happening to freemen, to monasteries, to local manors. So the written record of that day celebrated hunting. And when you hear about royal forests, you say, oh, it's just the king wanting to hunt. And wonderful illustrations in manuscripts like this were done of that. But Richard Fitznagel was the treasurer, if you will, the exchequer. He collected all the fines. And if you go back and look at the way money was collected in these days, they didn't have, again, paper. So they had these little sticks, tally sticks. They were stakes. You take a piece of wood, you'd split it down the middle so that the 2 pieces could fit back, and only the 2 pieces could fit back because they had exactly the same connection. And you would write on it, so-and-so had to pay his fine, so-and-so sold his pig to somebody else, so-and-so's right has just been annulled and taken away because he didn't pay his fine, and so on. This was all to raise money for the king as well as to record transactions to maintain peace. And out of the stakes that people had in the forest, we found the records of the common man in the forest. They were all kept in the exchequer in boxes, and at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, people began to translate and interpret these stakes. And this is where we get the expression you have a stake in the forest. You have a stake in the climate. It all is out of this period before there was parchment. Well, if I fast forward to the Forest of Dean, we can see how this applies in Dean. In the 17th century, the Forest of Dean had been relatively well managed. It was very far away from London. It was at the border between Wales and Gloucestershire, the Severn River. It was in the Wye River Valley. And every time, especially during the period of the Tudor monarchs, people wanted to sell off the forest or take back parts. The king wanted money. So he was constantly reallocating his forest lands to others in return for payments. One gentleman, he had conveyed part of the Forest of Dean to clear-cut the forest, so alienating the people there that they rose up in revolution. The same thing happened after Cromwell was gone and they restored the monarchy. And the same thing happened right up into the 1800s and the 1900s. The Parliament established Speech House in 1682 to house the courts, the verderers that dealt with the rights of commoners and free miners. Today it still meets in this courtroom, and somebody decided it was time to bring wild boar back. They had a boar farm and some had escaped, but then they proceeded to release boars. So there are now too many boars in the Forest of Dean. And when the verderers meet here in Speech House, which is this marvelous building, it's literally the only building in the middle of the forest. There's no suburb around it. There are no other buildings around it. It was built just as Speech House to allow the free people to come and complain to the crown. So they now deal with the modern issues of this forest. The Forest Commission runs it out of the Forest of Dean. Originally, 100,000 tons of oak were sent to naval shipyards. And in 1808, the Office of Woods at that time authorized the planting of 3,000 acorns per acre in enclosures where grazing animals were precluded in order to make sure that they had enough wood for the Navy and the Merchant Marine. Well, of course, you know technology. Soon we had steel and coal replacing wood, and so no one had to cut these trees. So when you visit Dean, as we see in the literature that celebrates it, it's full of very mature oak trees that are defended actively by the citizens who live in Dean, and the verderers meet 4 times a year to deal with it. And they oversee the Forestry Commission. Now, if I move us forward to where we are now, these rights to the forest, if you will, the rights to the environment, have suddenly become very topical as we've eroded the environment all over the world. So the United Nations, for instance, has in 2015 adopted a series of sustainable development goals. Goal number 15 says sustainably managed forests, combat desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. Well, just because it's there doesn't mean it will automatically happen as a matter of policy. So how do rights turn a policy like that into an imperative, into a mandate which will be enforced, which will be observed, and can last over generations? We've done that in 1894 in the state of New York when we took the much ravaged Adirondack and Catskill Mountains that the timber barons had literally clear-cut and raped, and we created the Forest Preserve of the state of New York in the Constitution. And the Forest Preserve says no part of the Forest Preserve can be altered. It shall be, quote, kept as forever wild forest land. There are other long-standing intergenerational commitments to forests. One of the most spectacular and the largest regime for protecting areas as a matter of right, as a matter of moral right, of the Zapovedniki of Russia, which was established also 100 years ago, and in this great celebratory year, and have existed from the time of the czars through the Soviets right to the present. Human rights emerged after the Second World War as a clear kind of right, but in the Charter of the UN and in the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we did not have a right to the environment. We still took the environment for granted. that it would always be there. It was just background. Yeah, we all can breathe the air, but we don't have to do much about it, do we? Well, the fact that rights have existed to protect the environment have emerged as a way to turn these nice assumptions, these pleasant policies, these benefits that we have, into something that we can enforce. This year also, the World Declaration on Environmental Law was issued by IUCN and UNEP, which wants to build an environmental rule of law as a legal foundation for environmental justice. And there will be a meeting in December in Nairobi in which UNEP and others are asking states to take pollution seriously, because pollution is not just a health problem, it's a denial of fundamental rights to environmental justice. Over the last 20 or 30 years, a whole range of European courts independently have ruled that, you see the quote, there is a positive obligation of states to observe the right to protection of health and the environment. Well, I was quite surprised this last spring, well, actually it was in December, when I began working with a group of lawyers in Paris, the Club de Juristes, which had been studying the IUCN draft covenant on environment and development, which those of us in IUCN had been literally working on for close to 25 years, trying to articulate what are international environmental rights, how can they be synthesized and made more coherent and made enforceable. The Club Juristes undertook a mission because Laurent Fabius, who was in the French Foreign Ministry supervising and leading the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. He knew that the Paris Agreement wasn't going to be sufficient, and he wanted something to provide a foundation and an enforcement mode for what is in the rather technocratic rules of the Paris Agreement and the technocratic submissions of states on what they might be able to do to contain greenhouse gas emissions. So we began a series of 70 international environmental law scholars and experts, mostly non-governmental in universities, but some in government, began to put together a text for a proposed global pact for the environment. They wanted to use the word pact because it was a different kind of word. It would not be as mechanical as a treaty, or maybe as ignored as a charter. So the word pact got adopted. And after 5 iterative sessions in which we fought over the text and it was revised, we met for one day on June 23rd in Paris under the leadership of Fabius Laurent, and we finalized the text. The next day we were sitting in the Sorbonne in its great assembly hall, which you see here in the picture, with Fabius, who is with the purple tie, Ban Ki-moon in the middle, and Emmanuel Macron holding up the text, which we had finalized about 8 o'clock the night before, and a bunch of law students from the Sorbonne had sat up all night preparing and producing for the big meeting the next day. Now, there were 2 people with close ties to Yale's School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. The only 2 Americans present were myself and Professor Maria Ivanova, whom many of you will remember. She is now a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. It was a privilege to be there. They couldn't have very many people from every country, after all. But this text, once it was released, was then taken by Fabius Laurent to the General Assembly. And on September 19 of this year, at the 72nd session of the General Assembly, was submitted to the President, who said, the President of the General Assembly, who said, "We are all realizing that as custodians of the only habitable planet, we must take action to ensure its future, and we must take it quickly." And this text is a way to do that. Article 1 of this text says, puts forward this right to an ecologically sound environment and recites that every person has the right to live in an ecologically sound environment, adequate for their health, well-being, dignity, culture, and fulfillment. Well, this is actually not so radical. It already exists in 174 national constitutions that respect the right to the environment and articulate it. It exists in 6 states, and this very year, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, under its right to the environment, actually ordered the reallocation of funds to help remediate strip mining, or rather fracking areas, the damage from fracking. There are remedies that come out of these rights as courts get involved. I've been involved with IUCN for the last 20 years in working to establish at the national and subnational level environmental courts. And we now have over 1,500 environmental courts around the world in 50 different countries whose job it is to basically provide a forum for the enforcement of these rights. Now, can the liberties of the forest be replicated internationally? Well, my argument is, of course, that with Elinor Ostrom, we can learn how to cooperate better. And the whole history of international environmental law is how to make cooperation better for humans and nature. That is really the core value of environmental law, but environmental law has been, shall we say, hijacked by those who turn it into rule-oriented manipulation issues. And it loses, as does the Paris Agreement, a fundamental imperative. We have to refine that fundamental imperative. And I think in the right to the environment, we do that, because you then have an appeal which is beyond self-interest. It is an appeal to a common right that is fundamental, just as the right to human rights is fundamental. None of us want to go back to a time before there was women's suffrage, 1920, the 19th Amendment. And none of us want to go back before the 1800s and the 13th Amendment and say slavery is okay in our economy. None of us want to drop out of a rights-based system once we come to accept them. So we're at the cusp right now of figuring out what is the rights-based system for the environment. Evolutionary psychology tells us we can learn how to do that we do have the ability to cooperate better together. Elinor Ostrom's analysis, it seems to me, is enhanced if we can say a common resource management governance system will be stronger if it's underpinned by a right to the environment that people can appeal to. So the Forest Charter did not cause all of this, but the Forest Charter is an example from long ago of an instinct that we have still in us today, the evolutionary instinct to use rights to assert a protection for a biophilic interest that we have, but also the ability to have our water, have our air, and indeed have our climate. Now, these are going to be controversial ideas, I accept, but why not present them here and see how you all like them? I'd be glad to engage in some discussion if you have time, and look forward to, as I continue this research and visit another 10 or 12 royal forests to verify what I found in the first 10, I'll be writing a book on it, so you're getting the preview of what I'll be writing. Thank you very much. Okay. John?
Thank you so much, Nick, for such an engaging talk. Can I jump right to the quick and put my stake forward and see if it matches your stake of the talk, namely the biophilic possibility of natural manifestations in the environment, rivers, mountains, trees, so forth. The rights of rivers has been dramatically put forward in several places, India, New Zealand, and so is it too large a step to move into that rights of natural processes?
Laurent Fabius says right now, yes, it's too big a step. We have to bring along those who do not even recognize that some human rights are rights. The international community needs to allow grassroots innovations in cooperation for environmental stewardship to take place. So what he's trying to do is empower every local area in the world to, if they want to recognize mountains and rivers as having integrity and rights, they can do it. But he can't force that from the top down. So the rights that are in the Pact for the Environment are enabling the ability to do that at the local level. But we tried, some of us, to argue that maybe we should put something in there about non-anthropocentric rights or non-human instinct-oriented rights. And he was very firm that that was not going to help the French get this through the General Assembly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nick, thanks for a great talk. Just a question. I approach this from an economics perspective, not a legal perspective, but I wonder if you could help me think through the connection you have to Elinor Ostrom's work here, in the sense that I think of those design principles as the necessary conditions in order for decentralized management regimes to come about and sustain themselves. But the context within which we're talking about it here is when sort of a king is setting up the rules and imposing them on the forest. So in some ways, I'm trying to reconcile where's the connection here between what she's saying and the context here, where it seems like it's almost the epitome of a centralized instead of a decentralized approach.
Well, I was not articulate enough in my recounting medieval history. The king never wanted to do this. This was always extracted from the king by the barons, the ecclesiastical institutions of the day, and the free men, the emerging group of commoners that had rights that were not absolute rights, but were usufructs. So it took until literally the end of the 1800s before Parliament finally decided that what people had been fighting over should be confirmed and no longer fought over. And then they began to add recreational rights. And in the Forest of Dean, there are big fights going on right now about should the Forest Commission give people in wheelchairs and baby carriages trails in the forest that they can use easily. Isn't that one of their rights to the forest? There's a group called HOOF, Hands Off Our Forest, HOOF. And they have been fighting to preserve public rights in the forest against the Forest Commission. And the Forest Commission is the heir of the crown and the power of the king. So the interesting thing about when you do this research, it does confirm her thinking that the common pool resources of forests, although set up by the king and used by the king and mightily valuable to the king for revenue, were never managed and part of a dictate by the king. He was the convenient vehicle for announcing laws. So just as the Queen does today, still, she announces laws, she sits to open Parliament. But when the Crown tried during the Conservative government's time to sell off parts of the Forest of Dean in the 1970s, literally there was an outpouring of hands off our forest, you can't do anything to us. And they actually got Parliament to exempt the Forest of Dean from anything the king, if you will, Queen Elizabeth II, could do to alienate their common shared rights to this forest. The Crown could no longer sell the forest, and the verders' rights to govern, if you will, an oversight system were preserved. The Forest of Dean is the only place in England where the Forest Charter of 1217 still operates, and the foresters, the verders, still operate with customary ancestral non-codified rights from the 13th century. So I think when we think the king or the crown is making this happen, it's actually the reverse. No.
One more question.
Nick, thank you so much, and thanks for your service here at the school. I just wanted to draw you out on the charter that arose from the Rio Conference in '92, which you've worked on, and we've shared the drafting together for many years. But it seems as though the Earth Charter has some relevance to this discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, of course, the Earth Charter was supposed to have come out of the Rio 92 Earth Summit, but states weren't ready for it. So it became a civil society draft that Stephen Rockefeller and you and I and others all helped participate in. And many of its principles can be found in these instinctive evolved norms. So I think, and if you take a look at the draft that you can go online and see the whole text of the Global Pact for the Environment, many of the principles in that pact reflect principles in the Earth Charter. They're congruent, although they're parallel and separate enterprises, just as the Forest Charter of 1217 is, if you will, in ways congruent and a totally separate enterprise. And that's why I think they reflect human instincts, because they come out of different contexts. And that's why I think a case can be made, and I agree with Ostrom that if we take a look at evolution and what it causes us to do to cooperate, we can learn how to cooperate better. And it's in our self-preservation to better learn that very fast because of what we're doing to the planet.
Nick, we're so proud to be associated with you, and we're grateful to Howell Pace School for sharing him with us, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you all. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. And are you carrying drafts of your paper?
Yeah, I have it in my, yeah. Well, it's fun. Yeah. I mean, talk about a busman's holiday, doing fieldwork trips by hiking around Royal Forest. Wow. What a boondoggle.
That's not bad. At some point, I have a question that's going to follow.
Yeah, so what if we just use this and get them to just pull it directly? What do you think?
They can instruction here on a stick or something, walk up and do it.
Yeah, or
And they can do it while we
emailing them to you. That's what we did last time.
Okay. Okay. Then we gotta download them, right? The only reason for doing this is thinking. No, we can do that. I'm just wondering whether or not. Do you want me to log in here?
Log in your email.
And we could just try and open them up.
If we have PowerPoints, who should we email them to?
Mark.
Okay.
Maybe both. My email is so bad. As in, there's so much unread stuff in there right now.
It'll be at the top.
Yeah, it'll be at the
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Which I could just log in as. What the hell is things like? I can't even use this. I need to get into.
Turn on the web.
Oh yeah, okay, so this should have applications in it somewhere, right?
It should. Usually they're down on the bottom.
Yeah, they are.
What's this stuff up over here?
This? No. There must be a way to open this up, right? Applications.
Look at that. Firefox. There it is.
Safari. We want Safari. Okay. We're on a Mac. Safari.
How you doing, man?
Correct. How are you?
I have to like give a presentation tomorrow at this meeting, and I have nothing.
Really? Oh, I thought your meeting was Monday.
Yeah, I have to go back tomorrow.
Choose an account. Use another account. Okay. Let's see what this works. Yeah.
If folks have a PowerPoint, can they email it to Mark? Email if you have slides to use, just email them to Mark.
see whether this even works. It may not work. Two-step verification.
Hey, how's it going?
I sent you a revised file.
Okay.
Email to both of you.
Okay.
Oh no, do us here. Okay. It's good. Come on. Woo! Look at that. Okay. Yeah. Oh, this is shared in Drive. You're kidding me. Why would they share it in Drive?